It is one thing for a civilization to endure setbacks, defeats, even catastrophes. It is another thing entirely for its people to suffer total annihilation. According to my guest today, the old mentalities and delusions that doomed the Thebans, the Carthaginians, the Byzantines, and the Aztecs, the four sobering case studies in his most recent book, are still very much with us, especially the last thoughts of the slaughtered, "It cannot happen here." Is the West, particularly the United States, on course to suffer a similar fate? To discuss this and much else, I'm delighted to be joined today from across the Atlantic by Victor Davis Hanson, the classicist, military historian, and one of the United States' best-loved conservative political commentators. Victor, thank you very much for joining me today on The Forge.
Thank you for having me.
Joe Biden insists that he has never been more optimistic about the state of America. Meanwhile, trust in institutions is at historic lows. The founding population of the United States is being subjected to an involuntary demographic transformation. The favorite to replace the existing president is the victim of relentless lawfare, and America is either directly or indirectly committed to three volatile geopolitical theaters, two of which contain nuclear-armed adversaries. In your view, is Biden's denial of reality a cause or a symptom of decline, perhaps even a harbinger, as your latest book suggests, of the end of everything?
Well, it's both. And I say both not trying to avoid answering, but had we a different president right now, just to take example, the much maligned Donald Trump, Russia stayed within its borders during the Trump period in a way that it did not when it invaded Ossetia, Georgia during George Bush, invaded Donbass, Crimea during the Obama administration, and then again tried to take Kiev during Biden. But there was a hiatus there during Trump. The Iranians were corralled. They were almost broke. We killed General Soleimani, the terrorist Baghdadi. Afghanistan had a plan to keep the largest Air Force base in Central Asia under protection by 3,500. It was defensible, and it was worth keeping. So, yeah, I think it makes a difference. But in the larger question, yes, all of these presidents are dealing with a pathology in America of too much complacence, tribalism. The Democratic Party has turned into a Jacobin movement of a mandated equality of result. And the result is that we owe $36 trillion. We're borrowing every 90 days, $1 trillion. We have no border. 11 million people came in, swelling illegal aliens to probably 30 or 40 million. Never had 55 or 60 million people in the United States that were not born here. And that in terms of percentages was the highest at 16. I could go on, but we're under enormous stress in this country, and it's divided. And the Democrats keep saying the Republican Party is not the same party. And it is true in terms of tariffs and symmetry, or the idea of reciprocity in trade. And it is a workers' party that is trying to substitute class for racial solidarity. So it's attracting Latinos, blacks, in a percentage that no other Republican had ever. All these sober and judicious Republicans like Mitt Romney and John McCain, George Bush, who said that they were ecumenical, they never appealed in a way that Donald Trump has. So that's a great paradox. But the Democratic Party is a very radical. It doesn't believe in borders. It believes you can kill 10 to 12,000 out of the million abortions, a very small percentage, but it's partial birth or birth canal extension. They believe that illegal aliens have a right to be here, and it's illiberal to ask them to obey the laws or to become legal. Crime has been, downgraded to sort of a cry of the heart, social justice protest. And then abroad, of course, we're in a mode of appeasement. And so I'm very worried on the larger scale. And but to be fair to the United States, it's a Western malaise. It happens in Europe. It happens in westernized Japan, South Korea. And it was predicted that from classical times that the combination of free market capitalism and freedom as guaranteed under consensual government was a wonderful thing. It was the only solution to the human predicament, but it had certain innate dangers if you weren't going to have checks and balances and you use religion and custom and tradition to curb the excesses. And we haven't done that. We've completely unbridled the idea of unlimited freedom and license.
It's interesting. It's particularly interesting as well. I wasn't going to get to this early, but you talk about a malaise there, and there's a very, you have to be clear to viewers who are not aware. You have 4 case studies in your book in which civilizations find themselves not only on the defeat, on the retreat in wars, but sort of fundamentally extirpated and annihilated. And it's almost a slight detail in chapter 2 of your book, where there's a Roman senator by the name of Nasica who warns the Romans that it's actually not the best idea in the world to annihilate Carthage completely in the Third Punic War, precisely because then you have no peer competitor to keep you competitive and to keep you out of precisely that kind of malaise. To what extent has the Western world, and the United States in particular, since that momentous victory in 1945, obviously even more so in 1991, been particularly vulnerable to this malaise precisely because there is no peer competitor? And to what extent might the return of a multipolar world, perhaps not yet, because the multipolar world is upon us, and still there's no sign of this malaise being cancelled altogether. But if there were to be a serious contest over Taiwan in particular, China being the real insurgent challenger to US hegemony in the 21st century, to what extent might that wake up the United States from its malaise?
I think so. You know, it's very funny. Nasica, that was a very common topos in classical literature, that you needed some type of existential challenge to keep people ready and sharp. And that was echoed by Matthew Ridgway, the great general in World War II who saved Korea. And he said it was incumbent upon the Americans to keep a war-ready military and to have existential threats on the horizon. Otherwise, we would lapse into just the consumption and the satisfaction of our appetites. So I think that's true. You know, Ian Morris, a colleague of mine at Stanford in the classic, I'm not in the classics department, but he is, and he wrote a book, War, What Good Is It? And he outlined what the left would call a utopia, that war was good because it consolidated states and it created great blocks. But I don't think he understood. I reviewed that in the TLS, that's exactly what Orwell feared with Oceania and East Asia, that three blocks, always rival, but within each of them controlling large land masses with uniformity of government, no freedom, and always saying that we were opposed to this particular, rather than a variety of challenges, of threats, and civic education, civic militarism. So yeah, I think that's a very scary thing when you have China versus the United States, and then China versus Russia, or Russia versus China, United States versus, and then everybody has to fall in, and then their security depends on the mega power dictating to them. It's been very deleterious to Europe, I think. I mean, Europe birthed the Western military tradition, but when you look at the British fleet compared to what it was, the British fleet was the largest fleet in the world in 1939 on the eve of the war and for the first 2 years of the war. And then you look at European militaries, and it's all predicated on the United States being the protector. And yet it's kind of a passive aggressive, you got to protect us, but we don't like you. We're Greek philosophers and you're Roman legionnaires. That kind of it's not a healthy situation. So I'm kind of encouraged by what's happening in Europe and in the United States, where there seems to be a mass revolt against this globalized elite that feels that, sort of like Platonic guardians, they're going to run everything with climate change, transgenderism, open borders, and anybody who disagrees with them is considered fascistic or illiberal. And that was their dream, the Davos dream, Klaus Schwab, that we're all going to have a una-nation, una-party, una-West, and then people are going to dictate these so-called progressive liberal nostrums for all of us. And so that's why I think it's really good to have a variety of nations in a loose alliance of common values, rather than just one big superpower dictating everybody falls in line. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And so I think that's coming to an end.
If only they were as insightful as Plato, they're much more like Thrasymachus, I wager, from the early books of the Republic. But in any case, as well, it might be worth asking too. I mean, the United States, since the Civil Rights Movement, has had an all-pervasive race taboo. Eric Kaufman, in particular, has been documenting the way in which this has expanded in the subsequent decades. He's got a wonderful new book out. I had him on the show for the first episode of The Forge. It's called Taboo. His book is called Taboo: How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. And that is part and parcel. That is just a fundamental feature of the luxury belief class at the moment, both in your country and in mine. There is this obsessiveness about race, and it often means that elites are incapable of latching on to basic human realities that would have been accepted by generations prior to ours. And this feeds into the question about whether geopolitical disaster is going to awaken us from this sort of luxury belief stupor, or whether in fact this luxury belief stupor is going to make us ill-disposed to react. At the moment in the United States, I believe that the American the U.S. armed forces have missed their military recruitment target.
45,000, yes.
45,000. The exact same thing, as I'm sure you know, has been happening in Britain, and the real collapse in recruitment is occurring among white working class men, precisely the kinds of people who fought in the First and the Second World War. They're not signing up anymore, and I'm wondering if you have any comments about the way in which this all-pervasive race taboo has made us unable to realize that rather than fishing around obsessively for minorities whose ancestral attachments to America in your case and Britain in my case are going to be weak, and demonizing people whose instinctive ancestral attachments are going to be strong, that's been a disaster on the geopolitical front, hasn't it?
Yeah. What happened in the United States is there was a myth created in the Vietnam War that people of color were the cannon fodder for wealthy whites. And there was cannon fodder, but it was inordinately white males who died at double their demographics. And that's been documented. I wrote about it in Carnage and Culture 20 years ago. But what's happened in the American military, because of the adoption of Professor Kindy's good racism to fight bad racism indoctrination that, as you saw in that testimony with General Milley in Austin, they were going to hunt out supposedly cabals of white supremacists. They did. They did for 2 years, and then quietly in December of 2023, they released a study that they found no evidence. But the damage had been done because the way the American military works, especially the Army, is it's multi-generational. The grandfather fought in Vietnam, the father fought in the first Gulf War, the son fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now the 17-year-old wants to join, but he's not joining. And if you look at that 45,000, the Pentagon is just paranoid to release. They release statistics on race on every other category for disproportionality and hiring, retention, promotion, but they will not talk about it. But you can find the figures if you dig deep enough. And it turns out that in Iraq and Afghanistan, roughly 72 to 75% of all the fatalities were white males. And that demographic only represents about 35% of the population. So in other words, they went out and deliberately, after George Floyd, tried to alienate a demographic that had voluntarily chosen to go to Fallujah or Taji or Helmand province and die at double their numbers, and yet they were demonizing them. And now, if you watch a commercial in the United States, it's no longer, for 3 years we had, you should join America because pregnant women can have flight suits, or trans people feel at home, or there was a black or a Latino sergeant talking to a private who doesn't know anything who happens to be white. Now, all of a sudden, it's back to be all you can be, and you see all these big muscular white guys jumping into helicopters, and so they don't admit it, but they are self-correcting, and I think it's too late. Unfortunately, it's not just that we're only spending 3% of GDP, and we have this revolving door in the United States where 4-star admirals and generals then rotate out to the big five, which are Northrop, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed. And then they are lobbyists and they use their contacts, the subordinates still in the appropriations in the Pentagon. And the result is, as we see in Ukraine and Russia, where each side are building drones for 3,000 or 4,000, we're giving contracts not for 1 million drones, but for 1,000 drones, but maybe at $2 to $3 million each, very sophisticated. So we're very ill prepared for a Taiwanese encounter. We have these big multi-billion-dollar carriers. We have these $175 million fighters, but the world is changing, as we see in Ukraine, where these off-the-shelf small little drones can destroy the Russian fleet. And we're not doing any of that because people can't break into the procurement monopoly that we have that's really run by these big corporations, but more importantly, by the generals and admirals who go to work for them as lobbyists. And that has to change. We have to spend more on GDP. We've got to stop the racial polarization, the demonization. We lost 8,500 of the best soldiers we had. They were mostly rural, white, middle class, and they had natural immunity from prior COVID infections. And we told them they had to have the mRNA vaccinations, and they left. And yeah. So if you wanted to hurt the United States in the last 4 years, I think you would come up with something along the lines: we want to alienate white males so they don't join the military. We would like to open the border and destroy the security of the United States in the South. We want to let in 12 million people that have no skills, no background, no propensity for income. Many of them criminals, many of them deliberately sent here by Venezuela and Latin American countries to empty out their institutions and jails. And then we want to redefine crime as sort of a cry of the heart. Smash and grab, looting, it's not really a felony. And then we want to take the U.S. government and weaponize the CIA, FBI, and DOJ to go after political enemies. And if you were to do that, you'd almost destroy the country. And that's exactly what or whoever is running the United States government now. I don't think it's Joe Biden at all. I think it's people from the prior administration, the Samantha Powers, the Valerie Jarretts, the Eric Holders, and their subordinates, and the Obamas that are in all of the cabinet seats of the Biden administration.
The four case studies that you draw upon in your book, The End of Everything, utterly fascinating. But one thing that I was wondering in advance, the only thing that I can think of at an overt, superficial level that unites these four cases, and so for viewers who are not familiar, we have Alexander the Great's annihilation of the Thebans. We have Scipio Aemilianus's annihilation of the Carthaginians. We have Sultan Mehmed II's annihilation of the Byzantines in 1453, and we have Hernan Cortez's annihilation of the Aztecs, I believe, in 1521.
Yes.
On the surface, what unites these phenomena is that a civilization is completely annihilated in the course of war. So it is war which precipitates annihilation. But I'm wondering, given the alarming topicality of this subject matter in the contemporary age, in a nuclear armed age, to what extent is it feasible to expect civilizations to be annihilated in the course of war in the same way that Alexander the Great would completely level Thebes? Surely the logic of deterrence would dictate that either one civilization, one great power gets annihilated, or none. Either all of them get annihilated, or none do at all.
Yes. Well, it turns out that almost every war in history, it does not lead to the annihilation. It leads to the defeat, the capitulation, the subservience, the humiliation of a defeated. But every once in a while, these erasures occur. And I tried to get a typology of them in the epilogue. Usually there is a naive appraisal of their present state of military readiness. So they think that they're still the city of Justinian in Constantinople, or Thebes is still the city of Epaminondas, or Carthage, they're still Hannibal's city, and they're not by any. If you look and analyze their military or their territory or their financial situation, even the Aztecs were in decline. And then, of course, because of that misappraisal, they always think they have allies. The Spartans will save us. The Macedonians are going to come to the rear of the Romans. The Venetians and the Genovese will sail up the Dardanelles at the last moment. The empire of the Aztecs, the 4 million, will rally against Cortez and the Tlaxcala. And never happens because people make cost-to-benefit analyses in their own interest. And then they have no idea of the type of person they're dealing with. These are not Attila the Huns or Tamerlane thugs. These are sophisticated intellectuals. So Alexander's student of Aristotle and Callisthenes, they don't have any idea who he is. They don't really know much about him. They don't really believe he would do this. And they don't really believe that Scipio, who fostered the Scipionic circle with Terence and Polybius, that he would do this. Or they don't believe that Mehmet, who bragged that he had the biggest library in the Islamic world, would do this. Or Cortez would do this. So there's a misappraisal about this. And when you transfer it to the modern, getting more pertinent to your question, human nature hasn't changed, but the delivery systems of annihilation have. We have nuclear weapons, both tactical and strategic. We have bioweapons, as we saw, whatever COVID-19 was, it seemed to be made in a lab. I don't think it was a bioweapon, but it was made in a lab, gain of function under the charge of the People's Liberation Army. And then we, of course, have chemical and nerve, and now we have AI. The Pentagon did a study on computer simulation about a year ago or 2 years ago where they designed a AI delivery system to go and attack an enemy, all computer simulated. And they didn't realize how well they had programmed it to ward off potential challenges that might stop it from hitting its target. So the operator hit the kill button. And when he hit the kill button, the missile reversed course and came right at him. And at that point, they shut it down. So you can see that that's going to be a challenge. And then the question is, are there people on the present scene that feel that annihilation would be in their interest? The person that I was most surprised about was Recep Erdogan. He has said some things that are, I mean, he has said that the 50 or 60 nuclear weapons at Isilik Air Force Base, some of them 1 or 2 megaton, are not really the United States. They've been there so long, they're proprietary Turkish. And when they had that coup 6 or 7 years ago, he cut off power to the Americans and said, do not remove them. I'm told confidentially that people are taking one of these bombs out. We are. Stealthily. I don't know if that's true, but he threatened in the last 5 years to wipe out the Kurds. He said he's going to send missiles to wipe out Athens. He was very happy that Nagorno corridor, that there were ethnically cleansed 200,000 Armenians that had been there since the Middle Ages. He was very happy about that. He's threatened to help Iran to wipe out the Israelis in Gaza. He's threatened Cyprus especially. And then we have no need to mention Kim Jong-un, who's now active again, talking with the missiles as his quietude is over, apparently. China released a video, I don't know if you saw it, about how to destroy utterly Japan down to the foundations if it should intervene against them when they tried to take over Taiwan. I counted, I think, 35 instances of a Russian general political figure or media figure claiming that they wanted to use both tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, including attacking the British homeland. I don't know if you remember that. Mr. Putin said, Medvedev said that he would like to nuke Britain. And then, of course, we have Iran. 20 years ago, Mr. Rafsanjani said it was a nice thing that the Jewish state had put half the world's Jews in one place because it made it a one-bomb state. And they keep saying that, they talk in existential terms. And the thing is, like these ancient examples, we write this off as rhetoric. They would never do it. Can't happen here. But I think it can happen here. And we're completely unaware, especially in the Ukraine. I think we all support Ukraine and we all sympathize with it. We wish the Russians wouldn't do it. It's very similar to the Winter War of 1939-40 when they did that attack, but they don't learn the lessons of history. Mr. Mannerheim, the Finnish commander, beat back the Russians, but he wasn't stupid enough to think that he could defeat Russia. He inflicted 500,000 casualties. Then he ceded 9% of Finland and saved it. But nobody in Ukraine does not have the wherewithal to get back to the Donbass and Crimea, and no U.S. president has ever said that they should do that by force. Not Obama, not Trump, not Biden. And yet we think, and we advise them to have this disastrous spring offensive. They've lost 300,000 casualties. Russia's probably lost 600 total casualties. So we're up in Somme, Verdun territory. And yet when you talk to people in the United States, it's always on to Moscow. We're going to give them more weapons. And you try to tell them they're running out of people. A quarter of the population has fled. They can't draft 18 to 21-year-olds. There's not enough of them, and they don't want to fight. And Mr. Zelensky is a brave, wonderful man, but he's suspended habeas corpus elections in opposition parties. But this is very funny in the West because they have adopted this idea. I don't know if it was the Russian collusion or Russian disinformation or the hatred of Russians in popular art or culture or movies. They always seem villain, that they're just obsessed with this. And they apply these standards in the United States, you know, very asymmetrically to Israel. They'll say Israel has to be proportionate, but we have to give weapons so Ukraine can be disproportionate. Israel needs a ceasefire now. No, you can't. You're an appeaser. You're Chamberlain if you even agree to a ceasefire. Netanyahu has to have a coalition government. He has to schedule elections soon. Zelensky can cancel elections, parties, and habeas corpus. We have to be careful about collateral damage. Israel must notify the Gazans in advance. If Ukraine send missiles into occupied Crimea, well, nobody says, "Did you hit anybody?" And yet, when you say that, and I've said that in print, you wouldn't believe the people who. I'm at the Hoover Institution that is center right, but my gosh, it's the people in our institution who are left and the people who are right agree that that we have to give the most dangerous weapons in the world, and we cannot. Ukraine cannot win that war unless they start targeting Russian supplies, Russian military bases. And then when Putin goes down to Cuba with a couple of ships and reminds everybody that the proxy rules in the past were no one uses a proxy to hit the homeland of the adversary. It always has to be in a third party place like Vietnam or Korea. And yet we're doing that. So he's reminding us that in 1962, Khrushchev broke the rules and used a proxy to point nuclear weapons at us. And that we went to DEFCON 5, I think, almost to that, ready to launch. And now he's saying, you see, do you like this? This is what happened before. And it's very funny what's going on. It's very dangerous. I think this is one of the most dangerous times in my lifetime, especially with the Biden administration. Joe Biden is not aware of. That's another irony in America. People have said, would you allow Joe Biden to drive an Uber car? Would you want him to sell you something at a retail store? Or do you think he could be a monitor of children, school children walking across a sidewalk? Could he be a bus driver? Could he do anything other than be president and be in charge of the nuclear codes? And the answer is that's the only job that he's fit for.
Yes. Okay, so it's a lot of potential directions in which I can take this. For the moment, I'm going to say this. I readily grant that Japan may be on the hook for all sorts of trouble. The Ukrainians could be on the hook for all sorts of trouble. The Kurds, and God knows the Kurds in Turkey could be on the hook for all sorts of trouble. But neither of these peoples are nuclear armed powers. And even if the United States were to get involved in a very serious war in Taiwan, it seems to me that either they go up the escalation ladder and everyone ends up getting imploded, or the United States, in a worst case scenario other than that one, of course, lose a conventional war, but they remain a people in the same way that at the end of the Second World War, the Japanese remained a distinct people. The thing that I'm really concerned about as a European, as an Englishman, and as an admirer of the United States, is not so much total annihilation of a people being precipitated through warfare, but total annihilation of a people, total erasure of a people being precipitated by what we might call unarmed demographic conquest. This is a very serious phenomenon in the 21st century, and it's one, weirdly enough, into which there are very few historical precedents to refer to. For example, Alexander the Great might have saved himself a huge amount of trouble. I mean, he lost 500 men in razing Thebes to the ground, as I understand from your book. This was on the eve of a desire to invade the whole of Persia. That's no mean feat. That requires serious manpower, serious Macedonian manpower. He might have saved himself an awful lot of trouble if he had just sponsored wave upon wave of fighting-age male Macedonian migrants to immigrate peacefully in an unarmed fashion into the city of Thebes. But of course, that would have required the Thebans to be pathologically altruistic enough to welcome those Macedonian arrivals as potentially assimilable future Thebans in the making. Likewise, as far as I'm aware, there were no Byzantines clamoring for the Theodosian walls to be collapsed on the eve of the Turkish invasion of Constantinople. And so it seems to me that the United States in particular, and Europe as well, through the Americanized intellectual influence, is possessed of a kind of pathological altruism when it comes to defending their own inheritance, which makes them vulnerable to being, so to speak, manipulated out of their own civilization, manipulated out of their own peoplehood, manipulated out of their own right to an in-group preference, such that you don't even need to bloody invade these places. You just need to sponsor wave upon wave of immigration, and demographics will do the job for you.
I think that's what we're worried about here. We're worried especially because when you have 50 million people who were not born in the United States and you have no civic education, assimilation, and integration, 27% of the people in California were not born in the United States. It has geostrategic affairs. I live in a community where 95% are Hispanic, and if you tried to tell them who Winston Churchill was, the special relationship between Britain and the United States, and during the Falklands War 40 years ago, I can tell you that every single person in my town was for Argentina except me. And so it's a big danger, and it's also very disturbing that we can't defend our culture. For example, we have all these people leaving and abandoning the Spanish indigenous paradigm in Latin America, and they want to come here. And we never say to ourselves, why do you want to come here? Is it our independent judiciary, rule of law, market capitalism, private property? We don't articulate that. We just say, well, we must have done something wrong and exploited people and got rich, and therefore we have to pay penance by letting all these people in. And then you have the left who feels that race, and they were, at one time, they were for the Martin Luther King dream of intermarriage, assimilation, integration, content of your character, but now they feel that their paradigm of mandated equality and big government doesn't work. And you can see the rebellion against Europe, all through Europe, the Trump phenomenon. And one of the ways they feel that they can counteract that is to get new constituents, especially poor constituents who have claims in this new Marxist binary that we're all addicted to, of oppressor, oppressed, victimize, victimizer. That if we bring all of these people in, they need enormous health, education, housing, food, supplements, and that we must do this because somebody in our past exploited these people. And yet we know what they're doing, the left. They're trying to grow the government. They're trying to raise taxes. They're trying to create a dependent constituency that will vote for a generation or two for them. And then when you object to it, they call you a racist who's promulgating the Great Replacement theory. When they talk to themselves and write books, they brag about it and say demography is destiny, the new democratic majority. And so, yeah, that's one thing. And if you look at it, just to finish, China sends processed fentanyl to the Mexican cartels. They smuggle it across this open border. They have killed 100,000 Americans. And I say killed because it's not quite that they're committing suicide, because they are taking pills like Ativan or Valium or that have been disguised as fentanyl. Fentanyl's so cheap that every type of illicit drug that's not toxic or lethal, they will put fentanyl in it. And that accounts for most of the killings. And then they launder the money back. They also launder the money for the cartels. So we lose 100,000 of them. We have 30,000 Chinese males who came in across the border. No one has any idea why they were here. 12 miles from where I'm speaking on my farm, there was a Chinese connected biolab in Reedley, California. They went over and found it. There was genetically altered mice. There were vials of HIV, COVID, malaria, smallpox in the vials in this warehouse. Nobody in downtown of this little agrarian community. We had a Chinese balloon that traversed 9 days across the United States before we finally were forced to shoot it down, the Biden administration. We have about 250,000 acres of farmland bought by China adjacent to strategically important sites. And we have 330,000 Chinese students here, 250,000 Middle East students. And all of these people are anti-American. They're from illiberal regimes. So why would anyone want to do that? Because it's really, I mean, we're worried about Ukraine's borders and people, but we're losing 100,000 Americans across an open border. And yet when somebody objects, like Trump, crude and bombastic as he does it, they get angry at him. And so I think you're right about that, that the left has an idea that a group of very, very prosperous, liberal, globalist, mostly white and Asian elites on the two coasts where all of the universities are, the government is, the corporate headquarters, they're going to create this new type of country, and they're going to have a subsidiary multiracial population. It's going to be very left-wing and dependent on federal largesse. And the obstacle to that group in Europe and in the United States are largely white or people of mixed race who are traditionalists and feel that they created these societies. Maybe they were in the past illiberal at point, but they were self-correcting, and they have made, and the proof of the pudding is that all of these people who detest the system, especially from the Middle East, are dying to get in to either destroy it or enjoy it. And yet we're paralyzed. It's just, I don't understand why a British politician can't say, if you're going to come to this country, you're going to learn about the Battle of Trafalgar or Waterloo, or you're going to learn about 1939 to 1940 to 41 when we stood alone against fascism. But there doesn't seem to be any confidence. The same as here in the United States. I taught for 20 years in a university of mostly minority kids, California State University, Fresno, and no one knew what Okinawa was, Gettysburg, Shiloh. Nobody knew any of those things. And they had and what were they being taught? La Raza, La Raza, La Raza. The Aztecs were wonderful people. It was a lie. They had human sacrifice constantly. And so I do think, though, that when you look at the world today, the left is in retreat, that they've had their power, and everything they touch, they have an on Midas touch. Everything they touch turns to dross. They destroy the borders, they destroy immigration, they destroy legal immigration, they destroy the economy. Homeless people, they're just incapable of dealing with a homeless problem. And the fertility rates, that their type of lifestyle that champions careerism, upwardly mobile government media, and children are seen as kind of an abstraction or a hazard or a waste of time. Our fertility rate in the United States has gone from 2.1 as late as 1995 down to about 1.7. And we were always bragging that we were the one Western country where ecumenical Christianity and evangelical Christianity would prevent us from ending up like Italy. I think France has the same birth rate as we do now.
We have a very similar one to yours as well, and I believe the only country in the Western world which boasts a fertility rate above the requisite 2.1 for replacement levels is Israel, and I'm sure that their strong sense of national identity and religious purpose has something to do with that. I'm going to disagree with you very gently about one particular thing. I'm always a little bit worried when people, and it's understandable, us as intellectuals wanting to overemphasize the importance of knowing certain battle dates in terms of national belonging, overemphasizing the importance of things like the Federalist Papers, founding documents. For me, it would be, in my country, it would be overemphasizing things like Magna Carta and the common law and all of these sort of intellectual inputs into national membership. I think one thing that conservatives really need to understand about human beings is that most people in the United States, to take your average hillbilly in West Virginia, is not a patriot because he's read James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Likewise, most people living in Shire country in England are not patriots because they know a huge amount about the common law and British history. For most human beings, national membership is primarily a function of a feeling that it belongs to you, a feeling that it's yours, an instinctive feeling that your ancestors were involved in building it. And I'm always slightly concerned about this sort of Vivek style, let's emphasize the importance of founding documents, let's emphasize the importance of the Federalist Papers, because for most people, national belonging is not an intellectual love affair, it's an emotional love affair. And given the inherent tribalism of human nature, I really do doubt the capacity of documents like the Declaration of Independence, documents like the Constitution, documents like the Federalist Papers, wonderful though they are for intellectuals who want to peruse them. These seems to me to be very thin reeds when it comes to, when compared with, gosh, I'm living in a country which I know that my ancestors built, and I feel an instinctive loyalty to this place, and I feel no possible allegiance or loyalty to any other homeland in the world. And I think to try and idealize exceptional immigrants who do really buy into the whole civic culture of the United States and to act as though that kind of assimilation program is scalable, it really is to fight a Sisyphean crusade against human nature itself.
Yeah. Well, I was just mentioning those because I'm a military historian, but I wrote a book called The Dying Citizen, and in it, I listed the elements of civic education that were not being taught, and they were the Emancipation Proclamation, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, and founding documents of particular state constitutions that we don't teach those at all. If you ask people what's the Emancipation Proclamation, they have no idea in school. I think the left realized that school is a zero-sum game. So each time they put in the diversity, equity agenda, they took something out. And that was by deliberation. What we're going through is very similar to the 1792-3 Jacobin phrase in the French Revolution, where it was an attempt at a holistic revolution where you would rename the dates of the days of the week, the months. You would kind of actually worship the god Ratio or the supreme deity, and you would destroy all class distinctions, go after the Coastal Church. You know, we trying to change the foundational date of 1776 to 16, 15, 1602, whatever the first black slave arrived here, we're told. That's the foundational date. And we have we have a new Juneteenth Day, national holiday. The first slaves were actually freed. We also have Martin Luther King. So where I work, almost every day, and I'm in a conservative, supposedly there is I think this month it's Pride Week. And then we have Latino Week, we have Gay Week, we have Black Week, we have Native American Week, but we don't have, Constitution Week or Lincoln Week or any of that. And so it's a splitting up. And one of the things that makes us very strong, we were always told, was our federal system where each state is semi-autonomous. And we have in the Constitution means of protecting that. So our senators are two from each state, even though, say, in Wyoming, each one represents 250,000, but in California, they represent 20 million. But what I meant by a Jacobin revolution, the left is trying to get rid of the Electoral College, even though there's great arguments for it in the Federalist Papers. They are trying to pack the Supreme Court, even though since 1869, it's been set at 9. They're trying to get rid of the 170-year-old Senate filibuster, at least when they're in power. They want to add 2 states to get 4 senators. And they want to actually tamper with the Constitution and make senators directly elected like House members, which just destroys the whole checks and balances of the legislative process of an upper house and a lower house with different criteria for election. And so, and especially yesterday with the Supreme Court ruling that the president has limited immunity, which ironically is going to help Joe Biden far more than anybody, because during his tenure, as you know, he had classified documents in his possession, and he didn't notify anybody for 30 years until he appointed a special counsel to go after Trump. And then he was worried that he might get caught. So then he called the government. Then Robert Hur investigated him and said, yes, you not only have classified documents illegally and unlawfully, but you discussed their top secret contents with your ghostwriter who had no top clearance. And when we subpoenaed him. He destroyed the tapes, which was another felony. But we were not going to prosecute you because you're so mentally challenged that no jury would convict you out of empathy. And so the fact that now he would have limited, because that happened during his presidency, these files in his possession, and yet all day, all we heard was, we've got to pack the court, we've got to pack the court, we've got to impeach the justices. And so I think, I know that as someone who's conservative, I'm biased, but I do think that the effort to radically change these ancient systems of constitutional government that were modeled more on Rome and Montesquieu and the British and Scottish Enlightenment toward the Athenian model of direct elections without, on any given day, 51. That's a real problem in the United States, and it's connected with open borders, immigration, the idea that the government wants to create vast constituencies of very poor, dependent people overseen by a bicoastal elite, a globalist elite with no middle class. And that's what's happened in the United States. In California, we've lost 12 million people. We lost 300,000 last year. They took $30 billion with them. And we're kind of a peasant culture run by $9 trillion of market capitalization in Silicon Valley. If I look out the windows here, when I grew up in this same house, it's been in my family 5 generations since 1870. Every little farmhouse had 20 or 40 acres. It's kind of an agrarianism where the parents worked with the children in the vineyard or the orchard. They had Little League, a local hospital. There was no crime. Nobody had any keys to the door. Almost every single family had sent somebody to World War II or Korea. And I've looked at it now, 2 things. All of the land is part of these huge corporate parcels. They've all been sold out or leased. And I'm not talking about 1,000 acre, I'm talking 10 to 20,000 acre almond operation. My small farm of 120 acres, my siblings sold out. I rented out to a person who owns 11,000 acres. And then all the farmhouses that were left are rented out to people who are illegally here. And so I look at these once very beautiful little farmhouses. They were trimmed, maybe 1,200 square feet. There's 15 people living in them. And there's probably 50 or 60 people in the compounds in trailers, shacks. And it really reminds me of what I've seen in Mexico or in the Muslim world or in Africa. So we've kind of imported a peasant culture and demonized and driven out the middle class, made it impossible for them to be viable and autonomous. And then we have this superimposed elite that's really, really wealthy, wealthiest in real dollars in the history of civilization.
I think it's James Madison who in one of the Federalist Papers warns that the wholesale embrace of direct democracy cannot but license, I think as he phrases it, the forwarding of wicked and vicious projects, something like that. And I agree with you that there is a decidedly Jacobin mold to the way that the left operates today. However, my read on it is that it's more that it's become more overt in the last 10 or so years than that it wasn't there before. And my evidence for this, I suppose, would be that the Americans have always had this understanding, have long had this understanding. Jefferson might be an exception, but the American founding fathers, at any rate, realized that what they were doing in 1776 and what they were trying to establish in 1787 with their constitution wasn't a complete reevaluation of things. It wasn't an attempt to start from scratch in the way that the French revolutionaries did. It wasn't to surrender to abstract dogmas. It was an attempt to reclaim a sort of restoration of sorts, an attempt to reclaim what they already thought of themselves as enjoying as a matter of birthright, given their status as Englishmen. And so that the American Revolution, revolutionary though it is, because they declared war on Great Britain and all the rest of it, it was nevertheless rooted in an attachment both at an intellectual level into classical antiquity, and you're talking about the balanced nature of the Constitution that was set up in 1787, but also a respect for English traditions. And it seems to me that America embraced that kind of abstract understanding of itself much more recently than the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, it's John F. Kennedy in the 1960s who describes America as a nation of immigrants. And if you're describing America as a nation of immigrants, you're completely neglecting that kind of paternity, and you're setting up the meaning of what it is to be an American as a sort of bundle of abstract propositional values into which anyone can just buy in. Then you have Reagan recycling these kinds of canards in the 1980s, and the GOP has been completely possessed of those through George H.W. Bush and onwards until the Trump revolution, where there is all of a sudden this re-emphasis on the meaning of, as you put in your wonderful book, The Dying Citizen, on what it means to be a citizen. And so I view this embrace of a kind of French Revolutionary style dogmatism about what it means to be a nation as occurring in the 1960s, and we are all the prisoners of that paradigm. And it seems to me that what we should be trying to do, rather than surrendering to a kind of very arid, anodyne form of civic nationalism, that's not to say that we should embrace a kind of hard ethnic purity style nationalism either, but because that's the danger on the other end of things, and then you get into very dangerous territory. But people, man needs to live on more than cannot live on bread alone. It seems to me to be necessary that rather than just talking about what it means to be a nation in terms of values, there needs to be an understanding of the importance of heritage, of the concrete, of paternity, of ancestral connections to things. And all of this stuff is just lost on that revolutionary dogmatism, which was embraced much earlier than Barack Obama. It's there in the 1960s, recycled in the 1980s.
There is the Heritage Foundation that has something called Project 2025. And they felt that because Trump was a pariah in both parties, and then the Mueller investigation, Russian collusion, all of that hampered, or he was inexperienced, and it was a partial success. So they have an idea that if he were to win, they have done two things. They've vetted 20,000 political appointments in a way that they didn't do last time. And then they have this agenda. And if you start to read it, it's pretty much what you talked about. It's a return to civic education in the schools. It's pretty ruthless about DEI. It wants to eliminate DEI in federal programs. It's more ecumenical, and it represents this effort, as I mentioned earlier, that Trump, he went to the South Bronx. He's went into Philadelphia. He's deliberately now going into minority districts. And his message, if you listen to him when he goes to a pizza party or a McDonald's, it's one of the reasons he's hated more than he was in 2020 or 2016. He's talking about unity, 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 and he's using the plural personal pronoun, we, us, against them, not in a deliberately divisive way, but we have more in common because we are the middle class, and you can't afford gas, and you can't afford to buy a house, and you are unsafe, and immigrants are swarming the dialysis clinic for you, and you're an American citizen, and we're all in this together. And I think that's the first time that I really heard a Republican politician talk like that. And he does mention capital gains cuts and deregulation, and that's important, but he's talking about, really, if you think about it, is remolding the American body politic into not a multicultural body politic, but a multiracial, given what we have, that we are 70% white, 30% non-white. He's trying to say it doesn't matter what color you are. You can come, if we can assimilate and integrate you, you have just as much claim on Jefferson or Adams or Hamilton than a fifth generation person. And we can inculcate in you what was the traditional American reliance on Europe, the special relationship with Britain, and we can teach you this. And that is one of the reasons that he's hated. And I can tell you that when you turn on American cable news today and you listen to MSNBC or CNN, and this is the subtext of a lot of it. He's creating a false consciousness. That was what Joe Biden meant when Trump mentioned it earlier. You ain't black, or you're a junkie if you report this. And there's a real paranoia that he may get, and this is inconceivable, because under our dialectic of politics, the Democratic Party has completely alienated its core constituency of 30 years ago, the white lunch bucket union worker. They're losing him at about 65-35. and they're losing white women even 55-45. And they have a calculus. If they get 90% of the black vote and 60% of the Asian, they can do it. But if they only get 80% of the black vote and they get 50-50 of the Latino and 50-50 of the Asian, they can't do it. And they know that. And that's what all the polls that they are running show right now, that Donald Trump, and no one can believe this, but each liberal poll shows him at 21% of the black vote, 47% of the Latino vote, 52% of the Asian vote. And if that goes true, and these are accentuated, which is worse news. When you run the national polls, he's only ahead of Biden by 2 points. But on the Electoral College, when you look at the polls in Nevada that he lost, Arizona that he lost last time, Georgia that he lost, Pennsylvania that he lost, Michigan that he lost, Ohio, Wisconsin, he's ahead by 4 and 5 points in many of these states. And a lot of it is because he has made a huge inroads in cities, Hispanic cities like Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas, black cities like Atlanta, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit. Even Minnesota is dead even. New Hampshire's dead even. And that is a result of, I think that's a very good news, that there's a possibility that people can be reminded of why they came here and why this was different from where they left. And if they were to replicate the culture and values of where they left, they wouldn't want to live here. And that's kind of a hard tonic to swallow. But I always said that to my Hispanic students, you enrich us with your food and your dress and your music and your art, and that's wonderful, but please don't tamper with the core. You do not want to import Mexican judiciary practice, Mexican government, Mexican ideas of race, Mexican ideas of women, etc. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that when I look at what's Milley's doing in Latin America, and I look at these parties that are Macron's problems, and I'm cautiously optimistic that there is a Western pushback, and the West is saying privately, because they don't want to say it publicly because they'll be demonized as racist or worse, they're basically saying the left has had power, and the result of it is the West is pretty much disarmed. It doesn't have borders. It has no confidence in a national Western identity or tradition. And its crime rate is going up. And the middle class, by globalists or climate change activists or whatever, they're under assault. And we're not going to do it anymore. We're going to try to push back and save the culture. So we'll see who wins, but it seems to me that that's what we're looking at in the next 4 or 5 years, some kind of gargantuan struggle of traditionalists versus people who want to race these traditions and heritages.
Final consideration before we finish up, if you have the time, Victor. So let's assume then that Donald Trump manages to broaden his appeal among these groups, which let's be frank, have not been particularly forthcoming in terms of their willingness to vote Republican for a good 20 to 30 years now. There's a reason why people like Roy Teixeira write books like The Emerging Demographic Majority, or The Emerging Democratic Majority, or whatever it's called. There is this belief among the Democrats, and then they're pretty wily political operatives, that once you import the third world, you will have a sort of permanent political clientele class upon which you can rely for an unending stream of votes. But let's assume that Trump manages to break through that sort of electoral demographic deadlock with the sheer resonance of his message. Do you think that he has learned the correct lessons from his experience in government from 2016 to 2020 in terms of navigating the machinations of the deep state, which are naturally going to try and obstruct him? And do you think that his plan to deport upwards of 15 to 20 million illegals who have arrived, particularly in the last 4 years since Biden has been managing, or we should probably better say mismanaging the border, do you think that he will be able to deliver on his core message, or will it be another 4 years of disappointment, even assuming that he does pull it off in November?
To answer your question, it depends on if he were to win, what happens in the legislative branch. He is one seat short in the Senate. There's about 9 Senate races right now where the Republican challenger is ahead or dead even. And he only has a 7 House margin in the House. And there's people on the left think he can win 30 seats. If he were to win 30 seats in the House and have a 4 or 5 Senate margin, yes, he can do that. And I think the first thing he's going to do, I don't think the left wants him to get vans and go into people's houses and rouse them out, but he doesn't have to do that. All he has to do is enforce existing laws. And some of the things that they've talked about is, if you are a sanctuary city and you deliberately violate federal law and you will not let ICE come in and deport people who have broken the law, then you're going to be cut off from federal funds in various areas. If you come in contact with a federal or state agency and you are here illegally, and I think they're going to calibrate that illegally first for the last 3.5 years, that 10 to 11 million. That they're, to be frank, they're a much more violent cohort than the earlier. And I think they will have to come in contact with some agency, and then insidiously they will be deported. The biggest problem comes when you deal with the other 20 million illegal aliens, because some of them, I would say 50% of them have been here 10 years or longer. They have not committed a felony or a serious misdemeanor, and they're employed and they're not on state or federal assistance. So there can be a way where you would not give them amnesty to reward their illegality, but you would give them a pathway to either get a green card or they could apply for citizenship. But the other 10 million who have come in the last 10 years and who are either on federal assistance or have committed felonies, I think he's going to apply the same thing to them. The reason I say that is the polls are showing, and this is what's shocking the Democrats, that 65% of the American people not just want the border closed, the wall finished, but they want people to be deported. Where that starts to lessen off is when you say somebody who's been here 10 or 15 years, and I don't know how, but I think he can deport 10 to 15 million people. He can finish the wall. He can go back and have the end of stop and release. You're going to have to apply for asylum in your home country. Things like that will make a vast difference. The problem, this country, remember, unlike Europe, it does have a better, it integrates, intermarries, and assimilates people much more easily than Europe does. It doesn't have that aristocratic class division at the same degree. And so our problem is letting so many people in. If you were to let in 200,000, 300,000 legal with skills that have to be self-supporting, they would be, and from all over the world, Europeans. If you said to the Europeans, we want you to come legally, and we will privilege people who are self-supporting with capital, we would get 100,000 Europeans coming here. And we get anybody that would, India, anybody. So I think I'm pretty confident that if you recalibrated legal immigration to, this is what Vivek Ramaswamy is talking about. If you could just let in 250 skilled people, then you're letting in really potential constituents for conservatism. Whereas these constituents are going to be dependencies on federal and state largesse. The worst thing about it is you see the government of Mexico and these Latin American governments are pushing this because once they get here, they get federal subsidies and state subsidies up to about 15,000, 20,000 a year. That frees up them to work for cash, and they send back in aggregate 60 billion to Mexico and 60 billion remittances to Central America. And the Obrador government is terrified because that's the largest source of foreign exchange in Mexico, more than oil or tourism, 60 billion in remittance. Same thing for these Latin American countries in aggregate. And he knows that. I mean, the person that the left hates more than anybody in the Trump administration, that's a hard call because they're all despised, but is the bald-headed Steve Miller. He's the Prince of Darkness, and yet of all Trump's advisors, he's probably the closest to him. And he's a very brilliant guy, and they're terrified of him. But I think most people, just to finish, are not worried that Trump will win in a fair election, the popular vote. What they're worried about is, under the guise of COVID, in March and April, May and June of 2020, the election laws in the key swing states were changed. I don't want to get into the changes, but what the net result was, we went from election day of 70% voting to 30% voting, and from 30% early or mail-in balloting to 70%. And the rate of rejection of ballots went in most states from a typical 5 or 6% of mail-in ballots to 0.3 to 0.4 by a magnitude. And so everybody on the right said, oh, they cheated. I don't know if they really did on election day, because it didn't matter. They were sending ballots in that didn't have to meet the postmark, that had an improper name. The address was wrong. It didn't match the registrar's list, and they were counted. Or they were what we call in America ballot cured. When a ballot for a left-wing candidate is not filled out, that candidate then gets a team to go contact that person and come back in after the election. And the postmark can be 10 days after the election. We could go right now to show up in person with a paper ballot, and we could have them all counted in 24 hours, and yet the left just will not do that. So that's our biggest worry, I think, here is the changes in the laws.
Well, God willing, the end of everything may yet be averted. Victor Davis Hanson, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.